According to International Campaign for Tibet, between the year 2012 and 2020, approximately 1,540 land and environmental defenders globally were killed. In 2019, an estimated 40% of the 304 human rights defenders killed were environmental defenders. Many Tibetans have been persecuted and even killed by the Chinese government for protecting their environment, and their efforts in raising environmental concerns are less recognized by the international community because the Chinese government and the international community treat all Tibetan grievances as only related to territorial conflict. Tibetans who have opposed and protested extensive mining, illegal land grabs, poaching, deforestation and damming have been persecuted by the Chinese police. Protesters are often arbitrarily detained, tortured and subjected to enforced disappearance, and detainees even die while in custody. Out of 50 Tibetan environmental defender cases surveyed by the International Campaign for Tibet for its recent report on China's persecution of Tibetan environmental defenders, 21 Tibetan environmental defenders are currently serving sentences in prison with an average sentence length of 8.5 years. 5 of them have completed their prison sentences. However, it is not certain that all 5 have been released. The whereabouts of 20 Tibetan environmental defenders remain unknown today. Today's episode of In Conversation with Tibettv, we are featuring Tenzin Palmo from ICT Germany, who is working at ICT Germany as its advocacy and research officer. We will talk more about ICT's findings for its recent report, Environmental Defenders of Tibet, China's persecution of Tibetan environmental defenders. Tashtale Palmo. So in terms of the Chinese government's intensified urbanization project, China has launched the Great Western Development Policy in the year 2000. And since then, hundreds of Tibetan environmental defenders have been arrested, persecuted for resisting mining, infrastructure and urbanization projects. The report, ICT's recent report, provides information of the cases only after the year 2008. Why is that? And why the report now?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking on this topic. So I might begin with why we released this report now. And we released it on World Environment Day on the 5th of June. And the reason we released it now this year is because there's been sort of a confluence of political factors, but also factors within our Tibet movement, the way we talk about Tibet's environment. So politically, at the advocacy level, there's obviously been a lot more attention on environmental destruction around the world, but also on climate change. But there's also been a real sort of progress in the legal recognition of environmental rights and the rights of environmental defenders. So late last year, in October 2021, we had 2 sort of big milestones in advocacy at the UN level. We had the recognition of a right to a healthy environment, but also we had the creation of a new UN Special Rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And this was the big deal because a lot of people in the NGO world have been working to connect human rights with climate change responses to make sure that human rights are protected so that individuals on the ground in communities have the right to protect their land, but also to look at how climate change is affecting people's ability to enjoy human rights. So a right to a livelihood, things like that. But then the other element, the reason we released this report is also that we never had a systematic list of environmental defenders. And while this list is only 50 people, we know it's tenfold, if not more than tenfold. But this was really important to have the facts, the individual faces, names, to show really the scale of the environmental activities that are happening in Tibet and the environmental defenders that are active. And finally, there was this need to correct this global blind spot on Tibet and the environmental challenges facing Tibet. And the specific sort of misperception that all Tibetan grievances are only about the territorial conflict, when in reality Tibetans face multiple challenges and the environment is often just as urgent as the political political persecution of Tibetans. So that was the reason we brought out this report now. And in relation to the scope in terms of the timeline and why we picked 2008 as sort of the starting point, you're very correct in highlighting that really a lot of the development policies began in 2000 with the Great Western Development Campaign. It's also changes to grassland management policies. And I think it was a real, for us, it was a real issue with just resources, that we didn't have enough time to do everything. So we had to pick a timeline, a marker in the recent history of where things really got worse in terms of the persecution of Tibetan environmental defenders. As we all know, since in 2008, there was a spread of there's a political uprising in sense, a spread of protests across Tibet, and this marked a shift in the Chinese government's management of Tibetan affairs. But we also note that really there was a big uptick in environmental activism after 2010. There was a real wave of lots of mining protests, a lot of land grabs that were being resisted. So we picked 2008 as a real sort of a point where things accelerated, things got worse. But let me just say that, of course, there were the environmental defenders and environmental activism predates 2008. So we still have an opportunity to build on this report and this database.
Right, right. Pamela, you were mentioning about the Tibetans who have been arrested by the Chinese government, who were not only defending environment, but they have other demands in terms of political aspects as well. So the reports present information, like you mentioned, on the known cases of 50 Tibetan environmental defenders, and that too, the cases since the year 2008. And there has been 157 cases of Tibetan self-immolators who protested against China's ruthless policies, repressive policies that include but not restricted to political aspects. So now the cases of self-immolation are generally categorized as political ones, right? Despite the self-immolators' explicit display of discontentment and their concern over China's aggressive environmental policies and accelerated development projects in Tibet, amongst their other demands and aspirations. So such cases you have not mentioned, right? So why is that? What are the challenges you faced in documenting these kind of cases?
So I think that's a very great question. And that was a challenge for us as we were establishing our database. Who do we count? Who do we not count? And I think because this report is obviously it's an information awareness raising report, but it's also for advocacy and primarily for our UN advocacy that ICT undertakes. And for UN advocacy, we need very strict definitions, especially legal definitions of how we identify someone as persecuted. And so we needed to create a very clear definition. And so what we chose to do was to specify only people who have been persecuted, so defined as detained, charged, tried, and currently serving prison sentences. So any of those, but those people, like you mentioned, who have self-immolated, of course, environmental activism and their environmental causes were part of their concerns and why they self-immolated in protest, but we couldn't sort of reduce it. Their concerns were not just one issue, and we didn't want people to be arguing with us and discrediting our work. So we acknowledged that many Tibetans who've self-immolated have expressed concern about environmental issues and specifically mining. And that others have also died in protest or in other cases where they weren't necessarily detained. And we acknowledge that, but they currently don't fit this very, unfortunately, required strict definition of persecuted. But it does not discount their aspirations and their concerns.
Right. Pamela, so the report mentions 4 major challenges to Tibetan ecology, Tibetan plateau environment. That is climate change, lack of scientific data, blind infrastructure development and resource extraction, and poor land management practices, right? So what are the implications of China's failure to acknowledge serious environmental issues, climate changes, challenges in Tibet, as well as its failure in engaging Tibetans in designing its response to climate change?
Yes, so this is also why this report is so important, to highlight why it's important to act now, because really the failure to recognize Tibet as a focal point of climate change and environmental destruction is really inaction has long-term effects for not only Tibet, but the region and the globe. And this is not an exaggeration. We have scientific data that really confirms this, that we know that at least 40% of the world's population relies on ecosystem services provided by the Tibetan Plateau. So I think the risk really is that we don't understand how the globe is changing in terms of temperature flows, nutrition flows, the beginning or the end of the monsoon season. So it really has destabilizing effects for Tibet's neighboring regions, but also for temperature and climate change impacts that affect other areas of the globe, not just the Asian continent. The one final thing I might add is one of the biggest risks that China faces and Tibetans face is China's inability to not only recognize Tibet's climate crisis, but also the value of Tibetans and the knowledge that they bring to the table in designing new sustainable ways of adapting to and mitigating climate change effects. And this really would be a lost opportunity for the globe to not empower Tibetans to enact and to draw on their historical experience and knowledge to design sustainable solutions.
Looking from the human rights perspectives, when we talk about the dangers of what are the dangers of Chinese government charging Tibetan environmental defenders with alleged criminal cases?
So we know that environmental human rights defenders have specific human rights that are extended to them, that are protected under the new environmental human rights resolutions. And as we know, Tibetans are not often afforded these rights. The bigger sort of impact of China's tendency to paint all Tibetan grievances under this criminal charge of inciting secession or separatism is really what it does is it actually it renders environmental issues invisible and environmental defenders, their voices invisible, because it says, oh no, environment's not a problem, your issues are just all political. And what it does is it strips Tibetans of their voice. And it also reinforces this tendency by Chinese, but also the international community, to not see the environmental issue. That's often the most urgent for some Tibetans.
In order to protect the rights of the environmental defenders, Tibetan environmental defenders, the International Campaign for Tibet, in its report, has come up with 7-point recommendations to the governments, United Nations Human Rights Council, United Nations Development Program, United Nations Environmental Program, and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right? Can you elaborate on these 7-point recommendations, please?
So what we really wanted to do was set out real action points for individuals to take away after reading this report. And the first is to really press China to uphold human rights obligations that currently exist, and to also press governments and the relevant UN agencies to raise the cases of 16 priority environmental defenders that we've recognized who are currently still in detention, or who we have some information on but do not know what has happened to them, if they have been released, if they've passed away, or if they're still serving sentences. I think this is really important. This is a tangible request. This is a list with names and photos. And then the next protections that we ask for is the rights of environmental defenders to seek information, to really express their opinion, to be able to associate and assemble, but to also be granted the right to free and prior informed consent. So that means to be consulted before development projects are approved and then begun. And then the second theme of our recommendation is the right to urge governments to really urge China to promote and protect Tibetan language, because ultimately Tibetan knowledge is stored in Tibetan language in the form of stories, songs, idioms, and our everyday sort of ideas of nature. And so that's a real critical point that is often overlooked. The third theme in our recommendations is to really promote the opening up of Tibet for scientific research and international collaboration. And there are two specific asks. One is to promote a regional environmental council that would open up Tibet for research, make databases more accessible. And then the second request in this theme is to urge countries to really push for a visit by a UN Special Rapporteur for the environment or for climate change to visit Tibet to really assess what's happening on the ground, not only at the high level scientific remote sensing level, but on the ground with people. And then the fourth theme is to, I think this is a big one in terms of our environmental work and how other countries respond to China, is there's a tendency to see China as a global leader in climate change action. And really this has to be challenged because it's definitely not true from what we see in Tibet. It's the perfect case of what not to do in climate change responses. So there's a need to challenge China's discourse and the norms that they've set around this idea of China building an eco-civilization and its self-representation as someone who's doing the right thing in the global stage. And I think Tibet is a perfect case study to disprove their propaganda-like claims.
Thank you, Tenzin Palmo, for your time, and it was a pleasure talking to you on the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ina, and thank you to Tibettv.
So that was Tenzin Palmo, the Advocacy and Research Officer at ICT Germany, with whom we had an informative conversation on ICT's recently released report, Environmental Defenders of Tibet, China's Persecution of Tibetan Environmental Defenders. Thank you for watching In Conversation with Tibettv.